Hey guys, welcome back to Morgan Hill Farms. So it is still definitely the dead of winter here, but we are in prime season for starting our garden planning for the 2025 year. Now you may be in an area where you have snow on the ground, maybe you're sitting in the teens and the 20s like we are at night, but I promise you, planning a garden takes a bit of time, and you'll actually be surprised at how early you may be wanting to start some of your seeds inside if that's the route that you choose to go, or how early you may want to be ordering starts or seeds from catalogs. Now, for those of you who are new here, I am in South Carolina, Zone 8A, but you can take any of this advice really in any area. It's going to work for all of you. Now, I started gardening in 2021 in this particular garden, and I grow most of our food here on our property. And I started from knowing nothing. My mother occasionally would grow some tomatoes when I was younger, but really I had no knowledge of anything. And over the past 3 to 4 years, I have been very successful at growing most of our food. So I'm going to share with you guys today how I start my garden planning, what I think about, and how I make for a successful garden year so that I can meet my goals. So that's actually the first thing we're going to talk about are your goals. Are you wanting to grow food for an entire year? Maybe you just want to grow food for that summer season so that you can get some fresh salads and fresh cucumbers and things. Or maybe you're wanting to do some preserving, maybe like pickles and jams and jellies. Or maybe you're wanting to preserve most of your food for the year. All of this advice we're going to talk about today is going to be applicable no matter what scenario you are in. So the first thing you want to think about is going to be your space. You really want to look at your garden layout and determine how much you can get into that garden. Now, if your goal is to grow a lot of food, even if you have a small space, that's going to be just fine. You can implement something called square foot gardening, where you plant plants very intensely and very close together, much closer than what your typical seed packet is going to recommend. The only catch to that is that you just need a very nourishing soil. And that's really not that hard to attain. There's a lot of books on square foot gardening. You will want to use a soil mix called Mel's Mix. So look that up. It's a very easy soil mix to make, but it's going to nourish those plants because you have so many nutrients that these intensely planted vegetables are going to need to take up. You'll really want to use that. Now, even if you have a large space or unlimited space, you still do want to look at that as well, because you want to be able to plan your garden in the most productive way possible. You don't want to be planting tall crops in front of really low-lying crops that might shade them out and really prohibit them from growing. You also want to think about if you're going to be growing a lot of vining things. Are you going to be doing melons and things that are kind of sprawling and take up huge areas? Now, one of the best and most fun things to figure out is what it is that you want to grow. Do you want to kind of grow your staple crops like your tomatoes and cucumbers? Are you just wanting to feed your family fresh salads? Maybe you're wanting to save some money at the grocery store on some of those really high ticket items like your fresh herbs. Maybe you're getting into homegrown medicines like medicinal herbs, things like chamomile and calendula and hyssop and yarrow. Maybe you want to grow those. So you really want to look through a bunch of seed catalogs, go on YouTube, kind of make a list of everything that you want to grow. And then from there, narrow it down based on what size your garden is. You know, what is it that's most important to you? If you are limited on space, you may not want to grow some of those novelty crops. Like one year, I took up an entire trellis with blue butterfly pea flowers. And although it's super cool and it makes a beautiful blue drink, once you add lemon juice to that or an acid to it, it changes it to a bright pink. And so it's really, really fun. But we realized that every single one of us gets a stomach ache when we drink that. So that's not something I'm going to be taking up valuable trellis space this year with. So you really want to think of that as well. Depending on your goals and the size of your garden and what you want to get out of your garden, that's going to determine how many plants you want to plant. So for me, because I am growing for food for the year for us, and I have done this over about 3 to 4 years, I have a general idea of how much I need to plant for my family. Sometimes I'm really accurate. Sometimes I'm not so much. Like for instance, in the fall time, I planted 150 fall cabbages. That is actually a perfect number for us. I did a lot of storage cabbage and they will last for us until the spring season. However, I've seen estimates for tomato plants, let's say, that say 6 plants per person. So for my family of 6, that would be 36 plants. Well, last year I planted 200 tomato plants, and that did not give me enough for the year. I was able to bottle up a good amount of marinara sauce as well as a good amount of salsas, but I think I only got 3 containers full of crushed tomatoes. I didn't get any tomato sauce. So there was just a lot of tomato products that I was not able to make with even 200 plants. So that's really going to depend on experience. There are books out there that try to guide you, but really you're going to want to play around with that. Now your climate's going to be something that you want to think about. That's going to tell you how long your growing season is. So for instance, here in South Carolina, the time between my average last frost date in the spring to my first frost date in the fall time is about 200 days. So that's a really long growing season in the United States, but you can actually extend that. There are plants that can tolerate frosts. Things like kale, your brassicas like cabbage and broccoli, some of your herbs, dill, cilantro. Shelling peas can be planted out before your first frost date. Carrots can tolerate frosts. So there's a whole host of things that can be in the garden and can be growing outside of that frost-free period. So you definitely want to look into that. For things that are frost tender, that's where that frost date really comes into play here. Ours is April 15th, but that's really just a guideline. That's just sort of an average over the past years of when our last frost is, and I never ever plant out on my last frost date. I will wait a good 2 weeks. In fact, I try to look at the weather and try to look at like a 10-day forecast and make sure that we're not even getting close to freezing, because some of your crops like your peppers and your tomatoes are extremely, extremely sensitive. In fact, peppers don't even like to be down to 50 degrees. And so I try to keep those inside extra long. So you'll want to make sure to pay attention to your last average frost date, and you can just find that on the internet by just Googling that and putting in your zip code. So that's very important information to know. Also, your climate is going to tell you things like how dry you are, how humid you are. If you're humid like me, you may find that you are plagued by certain diseases. So for instance, I can plant out 200 tomato plants the middle of the middle of May. And by the time that August 1st rolls around, they are all pretty riddled with disease. And so you're gonna wanna make some choices on what you wanna do based on your climate and diseases and pests and things like that. Now, when I talk about diseases in a lot of my plants, a great way to combat that is succession sowing. So although I'll do my first planting of tomatoes out in the garden from some starts that I start inside, I'll do those about May 15th. I am going to start another planting of those in about the end of May. And that's going to allow me to get another planting of healthy plants in the ground. And while my other plants are fizzling out, these plants are going to be growing strong, and then I'll be able to get a harvest from them in September and even into October. Especially your cherry tomatoes. Those have a very short day to maturity, so those take about 65 days to mature. If you succession sow those, they will come mature much quicker than your full-size tomatoes, and so you'll be able to keep this fresh food coming in from your garden for longer if you do succession sowing. There's a lot of other crops that we do that with as well here. We do lettuce, we succession sow with that. We'll do radishes, beets. Let's see, what else do we succession sow? Oh, we'll also do some beans. So things like that that have a pretty short growing season or that are going to be plagued by disease and just be taken out early. We always succession sow those so that we can constantly bring in fresh food as well as enough food to preserve and to meet our goals of preserving our food for the year. And another thing that I forgot to mention when we were speaking about climate is that if you have a shorter season, perhaps you're growing up in Maine, you may not be able to grow certain things, like for instance, sweet potatoes. Those can take a long time in the ground. We plant those around May, and I don't harvest those until October. The same thing with loofah if you're growing that. So there are some plants that take a really, really long time to mature, and if your season is a short season, you're gonna wanna go ahead and just avoid those crops because there's no sense in taking up room in your garden if you're not gonna get a harvest from it. Now that you know what you want to grow as well as what you can grow, you want to start thinking of different varieties or looking for different varieties. And that's where the seed catalogs that are filling my mailbox and hopefully filling yours as well really come in handy. So there's companies like Johnny Seeds, there's companies like Baker Creek. We also have one here called Southern Seed Exchange. Those companies offer seeds and varieties of seeds that are going to give you more success. For example, I've told you that our tomatoes are really plagued by disease. So I look at Johnny Seeds every year and I try to find those varieties that are going to be disease resistant. Last year I grew a variety, I cannot think of the name of it off the top of my head, but I compared that variety to my heirloom Amish paste as well as my heirloom Cherokee purples and a lot of my heirloom tomatoes. And I was very surprised to see that that hybrid Roma tomato was disease-free well into August, or it had very limited disease. So if that is something that's really affecting your harvest, you want to look at varieties that are bred to resist those diseases. The same thing with cucumbers. I have a really hard time growing cucumbers here. They are fantastic in the springtime. They're beautiful, they're prolific, but after that first harvest, they really start getting downy mildew or powdery mildew, and I need to succession sow those. So I really do try to go with a variety that is disease resistant. Also, something to consider is, are you really busy? Perhaps you have a huge garden and you're just doing a lot of work down there. Perhaps you've got kids, maybe you've got things going on over the summer. You may want to choose a variety that has a longer harvest window. So for us, green shelling peas, we love those. I think that there's nothing better than a fresh shelled green pea, but when those come to maturity, you really need to get them off the vine quickly or they lose that really sweet flavor and they kind of turn to like a starchy, kind of a carbohydrate, you know, really full of carbohydrates. And they just don't taste as good. So I try to find a variety that has a longer harvest window because I have so much going on down in the garden. I can't always get to those immediately. And they're pretty tedious to pick. So getting them all at one time is a little difficult. So that's another reason why specific varieties might work better for you. Also, you can see here that I have a Long Island cheese pumpkin. This pumpkin in the South is fantastic for me. Now this is an heirloom, but it is a variety that will not succumb to squash bugs or squash vine borers. I can grow butternut squash, I can grow acorn squash, I can grow sugar pie pumpkins, and every single one of those will get taken over and the vine borers will get them and the squash bugs will just decimate them. This can be completely plagued with squash bugs and vine borers, and it still produces for me, and I never have to succession sow these. They just will produce all season long until our first frost, either in the end of October or the beginning of November. So that's a really great variety. Some you're gonna find that you have to buy a hybrid if you have certain goals. Others you can stick with your heirlooms. And you know, I try to be pretty good about seed saving from my heirlooms, and I try to know how to seed save. But for right now, while seeds are available and they're plentiful and I can find pretty much whatever I want, I don't have a problem buying those hybrid seeds at the moment. Also, if your family loves something like eggplant puttanesca, which uses a lot of eggplant, you may find that you're better served by growing a large Black Beauty eggplant as opposed to sort of a small Asian skinny variety. So those are the things that you want to look at and consider your goals along this whole way so that it will guide you in your seed selection and plant selection this season. Now, with all that talk about varieties, I should mention that depending on how you want to get your plants or start your seeds, you may find that you're a little bit limited as to what you can grow. So for instance, if you want to get all of your plants at a local nursery, you're going to find that they are going to be growing very common varieties. They want to appeal to a broad audience, and so you're not going to find those exotic varieties and maybe even varieties that you see in a catalog that have really broad disease resistance. You may not find that your local nursery is carrying those. So that may limit you. You're also going to find that if you're buying your plants from a local nursery, it's going to be pretty costly. Over the past few years with inflation and everything like that, the cost of plants has just skyrocketed well beyond what you could start them from seed. It's always, I think, more cost effective to start them from seed. Even though there is a little bit of an upfront cost, you are going to need some shelving and some lights and of course some containers to put those in. But over the years, you'll kind of get a return on that investment because you already have the equipment that you need. It is going to take a little bit more time, but it does definitely help you to get a jump on the season. You could also direct sow seeds into your garden if you have a long enough growing season for some crops. So for example, I have a long enough season that I could direct sow my tomatoes. Like I said, I like to get a jump on those, but if I direct sowed them, they would be perfectly fine. There are some plants that I do direct sow outside just because they do better. Things like peas and beans, cucumbers, melons, squashes, pumpkins. They really don't like their roots messed with. And honestly, they get so big so quickly that it would be pretty cumbersome. So I just prefer to direct sow those. So I direct sow about 5% of our plants here, but about 94% I pretty much start from seed inside so that I can get a good jump on the season. And then there is one item that I will bring in this year. I typically start my onions from seed, but the past couple of years I have found that once they start, they tend to kind of fizzle out in here for some reason, and I'm really only getting about 10 to 15% of what I'm starting out into my garden because the other plants have just died or they're just too weak to handle the elements. And so this year I'm going to be ordering in bulk onions from Dixondale Farms. I find that if you order them in bulk, find a couple of friends, they're actually pretty cheap. I like to order the biggest size that I can to give myself the most cost effectiveness because I really want to be conscientious about my resources that I'm using for my garden. Our growing here mainly because I want to make sure that we have enough food for our family if it weren't available, but I also want to make sure that we're saving money, and I also want to make sure that I'm feeding my family healthy things. So now that we have all of that covered, let's talk about some special equipment that you might need. If you find that you're going to be wanting to grow cucumbers, for instance, or maybe you want to grow some sugar snap peas, you're going to need things in your garden to accommodate those. You're going to need some special trellises or something to help those crops grow up. It helps to keep them disease free. That's how they prefer to grow. Also tomatoes, I find that tomato cages never work, so I use cattle panel trellises for those. My peppers, I really don't need any type of a trellis for. I just plant those very close together and they sort of support themselves. But that's one thing you're going to want to think about is what type of equipment or what type of things do you need in your garden in order to plant these plants and help them to be more successful. Now, once I've planned what it is that I want to grow and how much I'm going to grow and what I'm going to grow, I start to plan out when I'm going to start these things. So I always start with those things that I can plant out before my last frost date, which is April 15th. So the first thing that I would start inside, if I were starting onions this year, that would be my first thing, 12 to 14 weeks before my last frost date. Onions take a pretty long time, as well as I like to make sure that they're really well established before I get them outside. Also things like leeks. I'll also start my lettuce 14 weeks early because by the time that those lettuce seedlings are 8 weeks old, they'll be perfect to go in my green stalks. And if we do have a cold snap at night, I can roll them into the garage and keep them free from frost and free from damage. But I'm still utilizing that time of year to grow lettuce and bring it in so that I'm not having to buy it at the grocery store. Also things like brassicas, those will get started about 10 to 12 weeks before my last frost date because those are going to be planted out in March. Also leeks, I direct sow my peas early in March. Trying to think of what else. Well, I already have garlic in the garden. That goes in December, so that goes in November, I guess I should say. But yeah, basically anything that goes in or that can tolerate a frost is what you want to start with. The next thing you want to deal with are your frost tender plants. So things like your nightshades, tomatoes, peppers, your cucumbers if you're starting those inside. I do a lot of culinary herbs at this time, medicinal herbs. So 8 weeks before my last frost date is when I start the majority of my plants. I want them to be big enough so that they can be successful, but I don't want them to be so big that it becomes cumbersome for me and that I'm having to up pot multiple times because that just takes up a lot of space and a lot of resources, and you'll find that you become overwhelmed very quickly. So you want to make sure that you kind of get this timing down. And over the years, you'll find that you kind of narrow it down. Make sure to keep notes too, because that's going to help you know what you did the year before and if you were successful or not successful. And then you can tailor that to this year to help you. And I should mention with that I do actually start a few of my tomatoes and peppers very early. So I'll do those like 10 to 12 weeks before my last frost date. And I typically will start like a cherry tomato early. I'll start about 4 of those really early because those have 65 days until they come to maturity, and I can start getting food on my table much quicker if I start those extra early, and I only have to deal with up potting 4 plants as opposed to 200 tomato plants. So that's manageable for me, and I would rather have fresh food sooner, and so I'll go ahead and take on that little bit of extra work and start a few of those plants extra early. Now kind of comes the fun part. So this is the part where you get to go through and see what you have for seeds already, what you need to buy. Do you need new garden gloves? Do you need to bring in bulk compost? Do you need to bring in soil amendments? You can also get a soil test at this time just to kind of see, what your garden might need this year. So make sure that you have all of that ready for you. And then the last thing that you're gonna do is get your garden ready. So if you need to throw a couple of inches of compost on your garden, I do that every year. I throw about 3 inches of compost everywhere in my garden. I also refresh my walkways with fresh wood chips. I make sure that my trellises are installed. If I have an issue with irrigation, we're testing that and making sure that that's good. If there's anything that I want my husband to build me that year, like this year, I'm really wanting him to build me a wash station down there. I want him to get that done before the season starts, or at least before I start harvesting things. And so that is gonna be the last thing that you do. And then you're just gonna organize all your stuff so that you are ready to go when the time comes. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that it maybe gave you an idea of how to start a garden if you never have, or if you have, maybe it gave you some ideas and some tips of how I try to get the most amount of food in as possible. I'm gonna be going over a few things of varieties and specific things that I'm growing in order to feed our family for the year. So if that interests you, look out for that video. I'll be telling you exactly what I'm growing and how much of everything I'm growing, as well as how I'm going to preserve it or prepare it for my family. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're staying warm this winter season, and I will see you in the next video.